Right, welcome everyone to our latest ALTA Insights webinar, where we focus on issues important to title and settlement professionals. I'm Jeremy Yowie, ALTA's Vice President of Communications, and today our experts are going to provide an update on several important policies that affect your operations, including remote online notarizations, tax policy, data privacy, wire fraud, a little bit of cannabis, as well as infrastructure legislation and how it's going to impact housing. And we'll also dig into the recent election results and what our experts think will happen in the 2022 midterms. Still a little funny to say 2022. Before starting, I do have a few housekeeping items we've got to touch on. If at any time you have a question, please submit them in the questions box. We'll hold a little time for Q&A. It's basically a lot of Q&A, so please fill in the questions box. We'll get them pitched to our experts. The webinar is being recorded. All of our recordings are available on the ALTA website at alta.org/webinars. That's alta.org/webinars. You'll also get an email tomorrow with a link to the recording. We do need to thank SoftPro for sponsoring today's ALTA Insights presentation. And before I get to introducing the speakers, we have a short message from SoftPro. All right, well, thank you, SoftPro, for that message. Now let's introduce today's speakers. First, we have Heather McHugh. Heather is founder and principal of Resolution Public Affairs. She's waving. Heather has more than 20 years experience on Capitol Hill and the private sector. She began her career staffing members of the House Committee on Financial Services for 8 years, and also previously served as legislative director for Senator Charles Schumer of New York. Also joining us, we have Chris Morton. Chris, hello. As ALTA's Senior Vice President of Public Affairs, he leads the association's public development, political engagement, and lobbying strategy. And we also have Emily Tryon. Emily is ALTA's Senior Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs. She provides strategic policy advice and focuses on building and strengthening relationships between members of Congress and ALTA. So Emily, thank you for joining us as well. And Chris, I'll turn the conversation over to you.
Well, thanks, Jeremy, and welcome to Emily and Heather, both of you. Great to be with you, you both today. I have to start with something that I think is an exciting announcement that came out today, and congratulate Emily for her award as a top lobbyist in Washington. The National Institute of Lobbying and Ethics put out their list of 100 top lobbyists today, and Emily was on that list. So we are happy to be in her presence today, but most importantly, work with her every day, as with Heather, who has just been a really trusted consultant for us at ALTA and someone who we rely on to get our work done and achieve the results that we've achieved this year and in years past, which we'll talk about. But it's really great to be with you both and also with the members today. in terms of what we want to accomplish with this conversation, I think a few things. One, really from a macro perspective, just take a quick snapshot and have a conversation around the environment and sort of where we are on Capitol Hill and in Washington, as we head towards the end of this year and into next. Talk a little bit about, as Jeremy said, sort of what have we learned, from an objective perspective as it relates to some of the election results the last couple of weeks in particularly Virginia and New Jersey, and maybe forecasting what that means going forward, if anything, at this point, and then talk specifically on the back end about our industry issues and sort of where we stand. It's been a phenomenal year due to the leadership of Emily, of Heather, of our team, and in partnership with all of you. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the moving pieces on our key issues. So with that, let's jump into sort of the macro piece first. Heather, there was a lot of back and forth, maybe to put it mildly, on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which now has been passed through the House and signed into law by the president this week. And we had, I think, 19 Republicans join Democrats in the Senate, and I think we had somewhere in the neighborhood maybe 13 House Republicans. So, there was a lot of compromise, a lot of negotiation, but ultimately things like roads, bridges, waterways, broadband, all of those things now are funded in a pretty significant package. So talk a little bit about how we finally got across the finish line, maybe some of the dynamics at play, and then I'll bring Emily in a little bit more specifically on some of the impact for us as an industry.
Sure, happy to do so, and thank you for having me join me today. So the bill itself, the bipartisan infrastructure package in and of itself was never wildly controversial. It took a long time to put together, in fact, because it was done in such a way that it was always intended to draw, as the name implies, bipartisan support. The problems that held it up were less about what was in the bill and more about what was not in the bill. And it was specifically around the concern that moderate Democrats, there was an impression by progressive Democrats, the left of the Democratic Party, that the moderate Democrats or the right of the Democratic Party might not support the rest of the president's sort of social and human infrastructure package if they got their way on what the progressives viewed was the more important priority for the moderates, which was the sort of physical bipartisan infrastructure package. So there was a real push to link those two bills, sort of everybody holds hands, everybody works together, and everybody gets a win sort of scenario. And for quite some time, that is in fact what happened in the House in particular. There was originally an attempt to do the bipartisan infrastructure package in August, and then in September, and then in October, and each time it got delayed because the human infrastructure, the Build Back Better package, was not yet ready to go. And the progressives did not want to give their votes to the moderate package until basically the moderates had to agree to give their vote to the progressive package. What ultimately wound up happening was the moderates in the House signed and publicly released a statement saying that they would vote for the package, the more progressive human infrastructure Build Back Better package this week. They just wanted to wait for an official score to make sure that it was not wildly more expensive than they had been promised. They were promised that the social infrastructure package would cost about $1.75 trillion. Those scores are due to come back this week. We do not have the full information yet. There is suspicion based on the pieces that are rolling out that it could be a little bit north of there, but the moderates have made it very clear that they feel comfortable even with it a little bit north, passing it in the House, and that was what was needed. And because they passed the exact same bill that the Senate had negotiated and put together in July, there was no need to send it back to the Senate, and it just went straight to the president and got signed.
Well, thanks for the background. I think for many people, you know, the perspective of sort of how these things come about and what's at play is really an important piece of this. It certainly was a negotiated package. It was something that sort of all parties were at the table. And obviously, I think as we think about some of the things that relate to our industry, it's important. And that's where I want to ask Emily for your perspective on that. So, you know, why is it that this bipartisan infrastructure package is something that we think is so critical as we think about the issues that our members care about?
Well, I would kind of take a step back and focus on kind of the beginning of what Heather said. From the perspective of some of the senior Republican senators that I've spoken to over the last couple of days, having that bipartisan compromise, you know, a bill on infrastructure that was something that, you know, wasn't perfect for anybody, but really did get to the heart of some really necessary hard infrastructure needs, I think is really important. I think that we need to really focus on that as a huge win across the board. And back to what Heather said in the very beginning, that was never meant to be partisan, and I think that that's a real strong point to make. Hard infrastructure is something that is very important across industries, but it's important to our industry as well. When you think about the need for you know, roads and bridges and broadband is very important, and there are still places across the country in more rural areas that do not have access to broadband. That is something that, you know, becomes very important when it comes to house value and, you know, people moving into the cities from these rural areas. There's a lot of, you know, play going on there, and having those infrastructure investments is really important. It's important to every single state, and there's not one state that doesn't benefit from the funding and the priorities that were put into that package. But I do think that the fact that it was a bipartisan package is something that we really need to celebrate right now, because there isn't, at least from the outside, there doesn't look to be a lot of compromise, and compromise needs to happen in order for us to have really good constructive legislation moving forward. And we'll continue to work on, you know, creating opportunities for that. But it's really helpful for us as ALTA, as we're working on different priorities, to know that there is the ability to work across the aisle and compromise. Our priorities, we try to make nonpartisan as much as we can. And so knowing that there is kind of the history and the ability to do that compromise, that'll help us as we move some of the priorities that we've been working on as well.
Yeah, I think your point about broadband, just to pick up on that, I think it's a good one. And if we think about digital innovation in the industry and digital closings, and we'll talk a little bit on the back end about things like Secure Notarization Act and where that stands. But obviously, you need to have infrastructure to allow people to conduct those transactions, and so that's I think a key point. I think land development and value is tied to the health of the infrastructure around it, and certainly something, you know, that we care about. The one thing I'll just end with on that topic that I think is important is in my last job, when I worked for another insurance trade association, you know, one of the things we said often was we don't represent Democrats or Republicans. We represent the I party, the insurance party. And I think that's an important thing to carry through as we think about the things that we do, the three of us and our broader team and ALTA in general. You know, we bring different sort of relationships and perspectives together to get something that's, you know, important and common for both sides. And so I appreciate the comments you've both made on that front. So I guess then the final question, and sort of in this sort of segment of the landscape, is where are we going with this broader Build Back Better piece? You mentioned, you know, we're waiting for CBO scores to understand, you know, the cost associated with the plan, and obviously there's a revenue component on the other side to offset to make it, I think, which the intent is to fully pay for the legislation. But maybe, Heather, just a little bit further insights into sort of where you think this goes, and maybe timing, etc.
Absolutely. So the House posted their version of the bill on the House Rules Committee website, which is sort of where the House posts final versions of bills on the web. And they did that about 2 weeks ago. There are two official sort of scorekeepers, for lack of a better term, for Congress that decides how much everything is going to cost. One is the Congressional Budget Office, and one is the Joint Committee on Taxation. And they are preparing to produce a document that says how much this total bill will cost by the end of the week. Their public statement indicated it would be out by the close of business on Friday. I'm told that behind the scenes, they're saying it could be as early as Thursday, but they did not want to say that publicly for fear of missing that deadline. So the sense that House Democratic leadership has is that they will be able to vote on this probably on Friday, although also for fear of missing a deadline, they are continuing to say it could roll into the weekend. But regardless, before everyone goes home for Thanksgiving, the House will have voted on their bill. It then goes over to the Senate, and that is where probably a fair few changes will have to be made for a number of reasons. The House and the Senate have very, very different rules when it comes to dealing with the process we are dealing with here, which is called reconciliation. The reconciliation process allows the Senate to avoid needing to achieve a 60-vote threshold. It allows votes to pass the Senate on a simple majority, so that the Democrats won't need the 10 Republican votes to get the bill across the finish line. And there are a lot of budgetary rules that go along with this process. And there is a process that is known as the Byrd Bath, named after former Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, longtime appropriator, longtime budget committee member, that requires that each individual provision that someone suspects will not have a significant budgetary impact, everything in the reconciliation package, every single provision must have a large fiscal impact, budgetary impact on the US government. And it has to be primarily fiscal, the impact, and not primarily a policy impact. There's a lot of tax provisions in there. There's a lot of just straight appropriation spending provisions in there. There is less, to a certain extent, the creation of new policy outside the tax code. The Byrd Bath ensures that every single provision meets that requirement. The Byrd Bath also makes sure, so when they set up the structure in which reconciliation would happen, that structure is created in the annual budget resolution, which the House and the Senate passed earlier in the year. And it included very specific instructions that said that each individual committee of the House and the Senate had a certain amount of money to work with, and they either needed to raise or lower the deficit by a very specific amount. The House does not need to worry about those specific committee amounts so much. The Senate needs to make sure they do not mess around with those numbers. And so they will take all of this and things will have to come out because they exceed those caps. So that's the just technical structural reason things will have to change. For a political reason, things will have to change because the House, they originally tried to draft their bill to 175. It feels like the score is going to come back somewhere around 2 to 2.25. The House moderates have decided to accept that. Senator Manchin of West Virginia is not accepting of any of those numbers. He has made it very clear that he will not allow this bill to cost a total of more than $1.5 trillion. And so the top line cost of this bill is going to have to come down dramatically in the House. If the bill is scored at 2 trillion, a quarter of the bill has to come out. If it's scored at 2.25 trillion, a third of the bill has to come out. It is not just tinkering around the edges. It is significant, large-scale portions of the bill are going to have to be stripped from the Senate if Senator Manchin is going to vote yes. And they need him to vote yes because there are only 50 Democrats and they need every single Democrat to vote yes. So things that are likely to come out include the paid family leave provision, include, sort of pieces that are less central to the core of what Democrats are trying to do. And so some of the housing pieces might come out, which sounds a little weird when you're talking about Democrats. The Democrats are really leaning into sort of childcare and global warming, especially in these bills. Housing falls a little bit outside that scope, so some of that may shrink. Additionally, the global warming pieces are somewhat contentious because, again, Senator Manchin is the senator from West Virginia, and he obviously has a significant industry in his state that, has concerns of cracking down on basically carbon emissions. So there are two different ways that the Democrats are approaching this in the bill. One is through the tax code, which creates tax incentives to create green energy solutions. And then another is by sort of spending, and it tends to be a little bit of a carrot and stick approach, and spending tends to be on the stick side and the taxing tends to be on the carrot side. He is okay with the carrots, he is not okay with the sticks, basically. So a lot of that could come out. And beyond that, they don't have a good sense of what's going to come out. And that is important because it means that we've got a little bit more time here before we figure out what this bill is really going to look like. My old boss is now the majority leader of the Senate, sets sort of the floor schedule. He and his team would very much like the Senate to take this up before they go home for Christmas. Mr. Manchin may or may not be agreeable to that, and I will say the White House in the last day or two is signaling very hard that they think this could slip into January. So we shall see. It's really going to be about when can they get Mr. Manchin to yes, and what do they need to do to get it.
Well, and I think, I think that's well said. And I think to your point about year end, we've got a lot of things that are needing to get done beyond this Build Back Better piece, right? So Emily, maybe you can just touch on, what's sort of out there that, is the must do as we end, the year on December 31st.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're thinking about kind of what packages need to get done, we have the government funding piece. Currently, the government is funded until December 3rd. Kind of the thought is that there will be some sort of a short-term continuing resolution to continue funding a week or so, kind of as they follow through some of these other deadlines. And then at that point, toward the mid to just before Christmas, they'll do most likely a longer term CR into next year, because the appropriations process, they're not ready to put together any sort of an omnibus bill. That's not something that they really have the ability to get done this year. So we definitely anticipate a CR of some sort. Another December 3rd deadline is flood insurance, which will most likely be attached to any sort of CR like it has been in the past. And we anticipate that just kind of rolling through, not a lot of changes, which for us is probably fine as long as the program doesn't lapse. So that's just something to note. We continue to have deadlines upon deadlines on this program, and so it's important to make sure that we keep the program alive. And then we have debt ceiling coming up. And there's a lot of conversation as to when and where that is and what that deadline would be. It originally was kind of the December 3rd. Now they're saying maybe it can be pushed to December 15th. Other folks are saying maybe using extraordinary measures would allow debt ceiling to be pushed into the next year. I think that there's a lot of conversation around that right now, but it's something that we do need to talk about and do need to address in some way. So those are all things that are just kind of there. The other piece that should happen before the end of the year is NDAA. The Senate is moving to NDAA today, and we should start that process, and we'll see kind of where that goes and how long that takes, but there's a lot of pressure to get it done rather quickly. And so there's a lot of deadlines coming up, which compact the time. There's only a handful of weeks left this year, and really, compacts the time in which we can get some of these other bigger packages done as well. So there's going to be a lot of moving parts as we move into these next couple of weeks in December.
Yeah, thanks. That's super helpful. And just to the point of the NDA, and we'll come back to this, obviously that's got a 60-year track record of bipartisan success over and over again. We've got it's also the train that everything tries to ride on, and we've got a couple of big things in particular that we'll talk about as part of that. But I want to just switch gears a little bit and talk about not from a partisan perspective, but from a sort of a lessons learned or themes that have emerged in terms of what happened in Virginia and New Jersey over the last election a couple of weeks ago. And as we head to 2022, what can we, one, is it relevant? Two, are the things that we need to be thinking about, or the parties need to be thinking about? So obviously in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin beat Terry McAuliffe to take that gubernatorial race in a state where Biden won by 10 points, and obviously the northern part of Virginia has turned a pretty deep blue, but there was indications that that sort of turned back a little bit from a couple weeks ago. New Jersey, Phil Murphy eked out a victory. He was actually the first Democrat, I think, to be reelected to governor for quite some time. But he had a real challenge. And I think, Heather, maybe I'll go to you first. There's been a lot of postmortems on this, but give me your thoughts about sort of what are the things that particularly Democrats are thinking about that maybe resonated. People are concerned, obviously, coming out of the pandemic about cost of goods, or just the nature of the pandemic, and sort of children and sort of things going on in the schools and that kind of thing. So talk a little bit about how you've heard the conversation take place amongst Democrats who've been thinking about what happened.
So I would say a lot of people who are on especially the campaign side of the equation, as opposed to the sort of under the dome legislative side of the equation here in town, feel pretty strongly that the singular thing that Terry McAuliffe did that hurt his campaign, particularly in the suburbs of Northern Virginia, and also in Henrico County and Chesterfield County, which are middle to upper middle class suburbs of Richmond, the capital, that have sort of trended slightly more blue in recent years and went back red. The single thing he did that really hurt him the most in those areas was in one of the last debates when he talked about the mask mandate in schools and talked about sort of parental interest in having control over, more control over schools in terms of the mask mandate. And he was, first of all, dismissive of the need for parental control over schools, which is never going to be a winning way of presenting to especially suburban moms. But he also came down very, very strongly in favor of a continued mask mandate in schools. And a lot of people feel like singularly that is the thing you can definitively point to that hurt him in the suburbs. Regarding the economic piece of it, even the pollsters are not quite sure what the honest answer is here, but everybody is looking at the numbers and basically reading into it their own theory of the case. By which I mean the more progressive Democrats and the more progressive pollsters are arguing that if the Democrats had gone harder on the Build Back Better plan, sooner, they would have had more victories to run on. It would have excited the base. It would have excited, you know, some of those suburban moms who we lost regarding the child care provisions that are in there, and they would have given them something to vote for. It is the argument that you must give people something to vote for, and as a general rule, not just something to vote against. The moderate members of Congress and the moderate pollsters and media consultants on the Dem side argue that the problem is actually cost of living and inflation, and that Democrats have to stop spending, and that there was some concern that that would reverberate back and cause problems on the Build Back Better plan. It has not so far in the House, but it is definitely a thing that we hear coming out of a couple of moderate senators over in the Senate, particularly, once again, Senator Manchin, which is part of why he is holding firm at the lower level.
Yeah, you can see sort of some of those themes playing out for sure in the debates that are going on within the party. So Emily, let me just turn to you, and then we can kind of move ahead. What you know, any reflections that you have building on any of Heather's comments or outside of those, as far as the activities in the elections last couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what she says makes sense. I do think that COVID is playing into a lot of this. There's this, you know, COVID fatigue. It's addressed and thought of differently across the country. And so when you look at these microcosms in these particular states, it's hard to say that this is exactly how something's going to happen across the country. But I think that there is a real concern across the country with regard to kids in schools, kids in schools with masks, kids in schools without masks, and just making sure that the kids are getting an education that the parents are supportive of. And I think that that's something that a lot of people will probably try to run on. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation there. I think that, you know, there's a lot of constructive conversation that can be had there, but it's an issue that kind of was talked about, but kind of came out of nowhere. I don't think anyone really expected it to be as big of an issue as it was. And then it just kind of started rolling. I do think that, you know, the economy and inflation is something that we're going to have to continue to address, because, you know, as we move into Thanksgiving, you know, and all of the different news sources are saying how everything's costing a little bit more and this, that, and thing. And I think that's something that people pay attention to. Right now, people are kind of uneasy. Maybe most people are probably back in their workplaces, but not everybody. And there's a lot of different things going on. And when people are uneasy, they look for something to like dig in on. And so I think we have a lot of interesting kind of stuff coming up. We'll see what becomes those big issues. But I think that those two in particular became really important in a state like Virginia. And I think that there will be a lot of attempts to try to kind of work those issues across the country. But we have some time before now and then. And, you know, whatever happens with regard to COVID and, you know, masks and people in the workplace and people together and being able to be together for the holidays, I think those types of things might be able to change people's kind of negative outlook on some of this. So we'll see. But I think that that we've got a long time before midterms. And if we've learned anything, you know, when we look back, it was in, you know, January and February before COVID hit, we didn't have any idea as to what we were up against. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think your point about, you know, it's an eternity between now and November 2022. As we all know, having worked in this space, things can change on a dime, and you know, I think it's important for people to reflect on what happened, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be determinative, because there will be a lot that happens between now and the next election to shape what, you know, what comes out of that. So let's kind of turn back then to our issue set, and I want to start maybe with some comments around the Build Back Better and bring Heather in on this, which is, we talked about sort of the offsets and the revenue to pay for some of the investments that were being made or are proposed for the Build Back Better. For us, obviously, as with a lot of industries, we want to make sure that good policies are maintained. And so one of those things that we've been, working on very diligently with a broad group is the issue of 1031 real estate like-kind exchange tax provisions, which to date, have not reared, any changes have not reared their head, thankfully, because of a lot of good work and I think the soundness of the policy. But there's some other things too that are out there still that I think our members are, thinking about and focused on. SALT deduction, what happens with that? Maybe you can talk about that one in particular as it relates to sort of the revenue side of this and any changes that are in play there, Heather.
Sure. So the Democrats are definitely going to make some changes to the SALT deduction, although there remains a bit of an open question as to how those changes will be structured. The bill, as it will be voted on in the House, lifts the cap on the SALT deduction from $10,000 a year to $80,000 a year. And the sort of general idea there is that even in the highest tax jurisdictions, so you're looking at certain places in California, you're looking at certain places in New York, particularly in and around the city, you will basically be guaranteed to solve the SALT problem for everyone 400,000 and under. Everyone 400,000 and under would certainly get all of their income back, SALT, state and local deduction back, and it would also provide, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, a cap, an additional roughly 15 to 22 to 25,000, depending on your tax rates locally, $1,000 in cap space after the income to take care of real estate. So, the general thought is that everyone in the group that President Biden promised to protect, which was the 400,000 and under, would be solved there. That is the preferred option for particularly Mr. Gottheimer of Northern Jersey. That is because New Jersey's income tax is a little bit lower than New York or California's income tax, and by a little, I mean quite substantially lower. I think their top rate is somewhere around the 6 to 7 range, whereas the top rate over in California is like 13 something, I think, and New York is close to 10, DC is close to 10, right? So it allows a lot more space for real estate tax in New Jersey, and it also frankly brings in people at a slightly higher income than 400,000. It probably goes up to about 550 in New Jersey as a practical matter. And so the Senate, what they want to do is they want to keep the cap at 10,000, but they want to write something in that says, and depending on who you're talking to, this number changes, but basically says the cap will be, the deduction will be restored in its entirety for anyone making less than $400,000. So if you are making $450,000, you are still left with only the $10,000 cap. But if you are making $399,000, the deduction comes back in its entirety, and those people are taken care of. There is a little bit of a dispute among senators who are looking at this, and the two primary senators who are looking at this are Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Bob Menendez of New Jersey. Bob Menendez would like that number to be at 550,000 and below, and Biden and Bernie Sanders of Vermont would like that number to be at 400,000 and below. It's hard to know where this ends, but the general idea is to take middle to sort of like upper middle class families, like at least up to the 400,000 and possibly up to the $550,000 range, to sort of help make them whole and bring back their SALT deduction. And it will probably be less helpful for people above that.
Yeah, I think that that takeaway that there will be a change. It seems like, you know, all factions in the party are working towards some solution to mitigate what was done in the 2017 Act. So let's turn then to an issue we talked about on the front end briefly, which is digital closings. Obviously, we touched on broadband and the importance of broadband from an infrastructure perspective. We also talked about the NDAA, and that is now on the Senate floor this week. So the Secure Notarization Act, Emily, is something you have led us on and built a coalition, and we've been very successful in getting that passed through the House as part of the NDAA. So where do we go from here, and what's at play?
Yeah, so we're working on secure notarization to be included in the final package that, you know, NDAA, like we said before, is, you know, moving in the Senate floor now. Because it's included in the House package, it's a conferenceable item. So as we move through this kind of period we're in right now, as it moves to the floor, and even in the weeks prior to this, they've been going through a lot of pre-conferencing, is what they're calling it. So we've spent much of the last month or so really working very hard with the committees of jurisdiction to get clearance on the bill so it can be part of the package. And I think that I think it's very safe to say we are closer than we've ever been, and we continue to get closer and closer every day. And, you know, we're really doing what we can, working with coalition partners across industries, really to push this over the edge. We probably won't hear much about where Secure is until we move into that conference time, which is coming up here, depending on when we get done with NDA on the Senate floor. But it's exciting. I think, like I said before, we have never been this close before, and really having that pressure from the House to try to keep this included, I think is helpful. Earlier this week or late last week, we had our House champions send a letter over to the Senate, to the folks on the Armed Services Committee and on Judiciary, to really emphasize the importance of this and continue to have people talking about it. Our champions on the Senate side are working very hard to push things through as well. One of our co-sponsors is Jerry Moran of Kansas. I spent some time with him last night, chatting with him about it, and he, you know, is willing to go to bat for things and willing to make phone calls, and his staff, you know, is expecting information to try to help him do that. So I think we have a lot of really strong allies, but nothing's done until it's done. We don't know what the path for NDA is going to be, so it's an uphill battle, but it always is, especially this time of year. You know, NDA is the kind of vehicle that a lot of people try to get included in, because it, as Chris said in the beginning, is one of those few vehicles that you know will happen, that has a very long history of happening. Is very important, and both sides of the aisle and both chambers really know that. And so there's a lot of emphasis on getting this done. And so we're very hopeful that we'll be included in this final package, but time will tell. And so we continue to push every day to really make sure that our champions are continuing to kind of focus on this and talk about this, and make sure that those who might not have this as a priority on their plate yet are aware of it, and it gets added to everybody's priority plate so that we can get this done come that final package.
Yeah, and I'll say a couple things about that too before we move on to another NDA item, which is cannabis banking. But the work that our members, that those of you listening and the broader membership have done from our advocacy summit back in May to this moment has been critical to our ability to be in the position that we are. I think all of the meetings that we did during advocacy summit helped us build that co-sponsor list to the place that it is now, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 folks on a bipartisan basis in both chambers. And that's been a big difference maker. One thing too, for those of you who may be listening in Illinois, we will be sending an alert out to our Illinois members to encourage Senator Durbin in particular, given his jurisdiction over this legislation, to to be favorably disposed to release this into the NDAA. So look for that. Please participate in that effort when you see it, because that's going to be an important exercise for our TAN alert. So Heather, let me then talk about cannabis banking and the broader issue of marijuana legalization, because obviously that's been an issue from the financial services side that's been really important for our members in terms of protections against liability, given federal law versus some states that obviously allow commerce in cannabis. We support the Safe Banking Act. We've seen that move on various vehicles, and now it's on NDAA, went through the House. But there's this broader dialogue about the whole issue of legalization. So I know Senator Schumer is a big player in that, and I know you've had a lot of discussion. So maybe you can kind of just provide some context about those two pieces in particular, the narrow one and then the broader debate.
Certainly. So as you said, the Safe Banking Act was included in the House version of the NDAA. And it's interesting to start by noting that when the Democrats are in charge in the House, they tend to need bipartisan cooperation in order to get the defense bill done, because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party tends to oppose the defense authorization bill on the grounds that defense should not suck up as much of as large a proportion of the US budget as it does. And so they have to move that bill to the center. They have to attract Republican votes. That provision was included in large extent. I mean, there were Democratic supporters, especially, Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado, among others. But that is a provision that, from the perspective of House leadership, was included to attract moderate and bipartisan support to get the bill through the House. The Senate does not feel like they have, it brings, in the Senate, you need essentially near unanimity to get into what is called the manager's package. And the manager's package is sort of the whole game in the Senate. Like, if you're not in the manager's package, you need 60 votes to get through, and you need everyone just sort of needs to hold hands and sing Kumbaya on the manager's package. And there are a lot of people in the Senate in both parties who have concerns with the inclusion of safe banking. On the Republican side, it tends to be the sort of more socially conservative Republicans who just have concerns about opening the Pandora's box on cannabis in legalization in general. And on the Democratic side, it tends to be more progressive senators who feel very strongly that if we are ever going to get legalization or decriminalization across the finish line, that we need to hold safe banking back as sort of a carrot to attract Republicans to vote for that. And so the chances of it getting into a manager's package are pretty slim. What I would add on top of that is that one of the actual real powers of being the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader of the Senate is not complete veto power over whether or not some things are going to get votes, but pretty close to complete veto power over saying, no, that is never getting a vote. And that is where Senator Schumer is on safe banking. He feels very strongly, he is a very, very outspoken member of the camp where safe banking cannot move without being attached to decriminalization or legalization, that the two have to move together. Because if they let safe banking go, it will be and I think the vote counting largely proves this out. It will be a very, very long time before they have enough votes in the Senate to get legalization and decriminalization done. And that is actually his goal. It is not safe banking. It is decriminalization or legalization. And so he has made it very clear repeatedly, and frankly, I just spoke to his policy director about this again last week, and they reiterated in no uncertain terms that safe banking as a standalone is a non-starter in the United States Senate.
Yeah, so that's pretty clear from the perspective of where we are, obviously in the NDAA, and probably the nearer term, as you described, given all the other items. This debate obviously will continue, and discussion will continue. I think, the good news for us is I think we have made a difference and an impact, and I think there are a number of folks who will continue to press, like Congressman Perlmutter and others, for the opportunity. And I think, the dialogue continuing is a good indicator that it's on the agenda. It's just a matter of when the dam breaks and things move forward. So let me turn then, we're coming up a little bit on time here shortly, but one other important issue that we've done a lot of work on, and Emily, you've led our efforts on this one as well, is kind of being creative around how do we elevate the issue of real estate wire fraud into the debate. And last few years now, you've helped us lead an effort in the appropriations process to build awareness amongst federal agencies for, one, the need to better coordinate, better track, and provide data on the problem of wire fraud, and then, potentially come up with policy solutions or recommendations that might advance the issue and better protect consumers. So where does that effort stand this year? Can you give a little perspective on that?
Sure. Like you said, for the past 3 years, we have gotten some report language in the appropriation bills, a couple different bills regarding real estate wire fraud, and really have kind of elevated this topic. This appropriators is a whole nother group of members that we've been working with, and really expanding our reach as to the members that we talk to about this issue. You, our members, you guys have all said for years now that wire fraud really is the top 1 or 2 items when it comes to things that keep you guys up at night. But we've spent time trying to think about what do we do, how do we address this on the federal level, and that really is has been kind of a challenge. So a couple of years ago, actually Heather and I started kind of looking at this topic, trying to figure out what we could do. And with our background in the Senate, my background working on appropriations stuff, we decided to work on this report language. So now after the 3rd year, we really are starting to get somewhere. Last year, our report language in the Commerce, Justice, Science bill got the FBI to write a report and give it to the members of Congress, and let them know kind of what they think are, congressional answers, like different measures that could be done, or what they see as the real problems. Now that is not for public consumption, so we have not seen that report, but we know that the report is there. I think that is a huge win. And in the Senate appropriations report language that came out a couple months ago, that required that not only, well, it acknowledged that FBI report was given to members of Congress, and then requested that the FBI, in fact, do a public report and really work with industry. And I think that's really important. The other piece that I think is really interesting on this is it is an appropriations report language, and report language doesn't carry kind of the same power as bill text. But in the world that we're living in now, a CR is more likely than not So a continuing resolution, which means that none of the bill text will really live through this year, and they'll start over again in the, for the next cycle for FY 2023. So the bill report language that we got is what is the intent of Congress currently. So that's the part that's living. That is the part that will live along with any sort of CR as we move forward. So it's really important for us to really focus on that. I think that we have a lot of opportunity. I know that Chris has talked to Senator Shaheen. I talked to Senators Moran and Senator Hoeven about this issue in the recent past. They've been working on this issue for us on the Senate side, and they're really interested in working with us and trying to see what they can get out of that report and how we can work together. And I think this really is an opportunity for us to have like another really big issue out there that we can champion and really be proud of us working really hard to address this concern. So I think it's really positive news there, and we'll continue to work with our champions on that, and we'll see where we go. But hopefully, come Advocacy Summit next year or the following year, we'll have some really good wire fraud talking points and things that we can work on together.
Yeah, great. And thanks for that insight, Emily, and your leadership on it. One thing, we've answered a bunch of the questions that have come in from the members, but one that we haven't, which we can take on here as we end, but is an appropriations question. So, and it's actually exciting. As the dad of 2 daughters, I am always excited to see what opportunities lie ahead for them. And it looks like the Appropriations Committee now in the next Congress with Leahy and Shelby leaving will have for the first time 2 women on the Democratic and Republican side at the helm. Is that correct? Heather, you want to, I think it's Patty Murray maybe is up next.
I would say Patty Murray is up next. She is going to almost certainly take the helm for Democrats. I would say that it is the first time that 2 women are helming that committee in the Senate. That in the last Congress, 2 women helmed that committee in the House for the first time. And so, it is, but it's going to be very exciting. Patty, and, for our perspective, Patty Murray was a long time subcommittee chair at Transportation HUD subcommittee and has a lot of knowledge of the approach process in the housing space. And so I think she'll be a really interesting chair or ranking member for us in this industry.
And on the other side of that, Susan Collins will be most likely the ranking or chair, I guess. And she also has a long-standing history on transportation and housing subcommittees. So I think it really is an exciting time to really see what happens and how this whole process gets shaped. They both are known to really want to work and get the bills done and really push forward. And so I think that that's going to be a really strong kind of opinion moving forward. And I think we're lucky to have folks that are willing to make those hard decisions. And I think those 2 women are a very good example of that. So it's exciting to see what we will have coming this next year.
Well, that is a perfect note to end on, and I'm really glad we were able to have this conversation today. Thank you both to Heather and Emily as always, and thanks for all the work that you do in collaboration with our members. So Jeremy, I'll turn it back to you for any closing remarks you have, but otherwise we can sign off.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, Emily, Heather, thanks for spending a little time. A few questions that we didn't get to. Check out Diane Tom's AU advocacy update that was sent out earlier this year, has a little bit more color as far as how the infrastructure bill will benefit the economy, real estate, land values, which title insurance premiums tied to those. So definitely a benefit there, and the broadband, which will help extend availability to that and also make digital closings a little bit easier to complete. So Emily, lots of deadlines coming up, lots of moving parts. So we'll be keeping an eye on the NDAA and movement there. And also, I had a question from Ron about inflation. We'll probably tackle that and Diane's advocacy update next week. Again, if you missed parts of today's webinar, I think others in your office would benefit from listening. A link to the recording will be emailed to you tomorrow. And again, you can always access ALTA's webinar archives on alta.org/webinars. Before wrapping up, I do need to thank SoftPro once again for sponsoring today's webinar. And Emily, we couldn't wrap up without congratulating you once again for being recognized as one of the top lobbyists. ALTA members should be very, very, very proud having you representing their interests. So,
thank you, Jeremy.
And with that, that'll bring us to the conclusion of today's presentation. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.